you would open your Bibles to James chapter 5, I believe is where we are. We'll try to wrap that up today and then get into our fill-in-the-blank activities. What I'd like to do before we move on into that this morning, I'd like to hear back from you in terms of where we want to go next. I don't want to hear about it all at once, please. So, please raise your hand. Auditorium classes are interesting. There's not a gag order in this class. You can speak. Okay. I mean, that's anybody got something else? Anybody strong about something else? Haven't been there. It's right after James. So if we don't have any objections to that, we'll start into 1 Peter. And next week will be our gospel meeting. And Brother Jim Dimmer will be having combined classes like we typically do in here when we have a guest speaker. So we'll skip a week until we get through today. That would be the 13th, I think. So we'll be back on the 13th, and we'll go ahead and start going into 1st and 2nd Peter. All right, James chapter 5. We'll pick up about verse 13 or so, just to sort of get our feet back into what we were talking about. Start class with a prayer this morning. Ask Brother Bruce Rosenblum, if he would, to direct our minds as we start. So what are some of the reasons that we study the Scriptures? Why do we do it? Why do we think that there should be emphasis placed on Bible study? Okay, guidance on how to live. We read a lot, and most of us all grew up having taught to us at younger ages all the Bible stories. And certainly that's something that we should carry with us into our adulthood and reflect upon as we get a little bit older. But the idea is that when we understand those stories, they're neat, right? I mean, like if you look at some book that you read about some hero who goes off and conquers in some place or some beast or something, and we like that reading and all that. And the Old Testament is full of Bible stories like that. But when we're young, we understand those stories, and they're interesting to us, and they're exciting. There's a lot of action and adventure going on there. But the point is that we need to be able to use that understanding of that story as a leverage to go beyond that. What do those stories teach us when we get to be adults? how to deal with God, how God deals with us, the patience that it takes sometimes to be able to endure things that are going on in our lives. The idea of knowing that God is always with us, even though things aren't just magically falling into place sometimes. There may be difficulties, but we know that God's there. And we know, you remember the story of Elijah the prophet, who thought he was the only one that was still kicking in terms of following God. And God says, no, you're not right about that. And so we see these stories and they unfold for us. And so we read scriptures in the New Testament, for example, about these scattered Christians and that James is writing to. What do we learn from that? We've learned a number of things from that. We've learned of a number of the attitudes that they have had. And we're going to see that continue as we wrap up in chapter 5 today and get on into our fill-in-the-blank activities. But we're going to see some people's attitudes. We're going to see the influence of the world. We're going to see what people think sometimes Christianity is. And all that's just in James. Now, let's just do a little recap as we go through and get to chapter 5 of some of the attitudes or some of the thinking that James is writing about. He starts off in the very first few verses of chapter 1. He says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing that the trying of your faith produces patience." Well, let's take that and let's step back from it just a minute and let's look at what's going on there. If he's having to write to them about enduring trials and tribulations, either, number one, they're not enduring them, or they're undergoing them, number two, and not doing a very good job of it. Or maybe even possibly number three, he's trying to encourage them not to give up. You're scattered. You don't have, we've talked about this, you don't have your church family base, perhaps, and you're struggling. And so he says, you need to be able to embrace these things, not in the sense that they're fun to go through, but recognize that they have a purpose, that by going through these trials and tribulations, you're going to be able to have patience or endurance. And we've talked about this before. Athletes that train have to push their bodies beyond what we would normally consider as breaking points to be able to train, to develop themselves to where they can compete at such a level that they need to compete at. And so he talks about that. He talks a little bit later on about a double-minded man. These people were apparently and you stop and think about it. What happens when you try to hold on to the world and you try to hold on to the gospel? You can't do it. A lot of people try, but you can't do it. And so he says, you cannot be double-minded in your thinking. Well, to me, to be double-minded in their thinking, we could talk about people that are indecisive, and that's one thing. But the other thing that comes to my mind is the fact that if you're trying to live in the world and you're trying to serve God, then you cannot make decisions. Because if you say, well, I'm going to serve God, I'm not going to have anything to do with the world, but, I like that. But I'm not going to do it much, and I'm not going to get excessive with it. But, and you see how you have to, you waver in your decisions and what you do. Then he goes on a little bit later and he talks about, for example, that he talks about the, basically, in my mind, sort of blaming God for the sins that come. I can't help it. That God puts these temptations in front of me. What am I supposed to do? I try my best, but I can't, escape all these temptations. So if I sin, it's because God puts temptations in front of me. James says, no, God doesn't do that. Then he goes a little bit later and he talks about in chapter 1 the idea of being able to be faithful hearers. Nobody can go into the law and look into it and hear what it has to say and walk away and forget it and be the kind of person he needs to be. It requires people who hear and do. And then he goes into the end of the chapter in chapter 1 and he talks about the idea of what pure religion is. So that tells me that as he writes to these people, they are corrupting what religion is. They're corrupting the teaching of the gospel. And he points out to them pure religion, undefiled. Notice how he puts that in there. Pure religion, undefiled, before God and the Father is to visit the widows and the orphans and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. That's what religion is. And so apparently we see that these people were not engaged in what God would be considering true, pure religion. All right, chapter 2. We go into the situation. He says, have the faith of Christ, but not with partiality. And he says, you guys are partial. You let people come into your assemblies, and if they're well clothed and appear to have money, you give them a prominent place. And if they appear to be raggedy and poor, you put them back in the back where nobody can see them, kind of thing. And he says, you need to have a kind of faith that makes you understand that you were bought with the price of the blood of Jesus Christ. And there's no distinction in there because of how you dress. Because what's important is whether or not you have an understanding of the Scriptures, and if you accept those, whether you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter. And he goes on and talks about some of that in chapter 2. In chapter 3, he starts to warn them about being teachers. Too many teachers, he says, trying to tell people what things are. So we seem to have a situation in chapter 3 where he is addressing people who have gotten to the point of where they know it all. They're just following the gospel to a T, and whatever they say or do is right. Doesn't matter, what God thinks. And so he gets into talking to them about how that they have gotten to situations where they've sort of elevated themselves, and yet what are they doing with their tongues? They're blessing and cursing. And he says, brethren, these things ought not to be. And then as we get on into the latter part of chapter 3 and into chapter 4, he talks about that there's wars, they're warring against one another. And back in chapter 3, he talks about that you try to devour one another. This is not how Christians act. And so we go through that in chapter 4, and we give some understanding of how they need to be reminded of the grace of God, that how He extends it, and that you need to get out of the world. And he calls them adulterers and adulteresses. Not because they have been unfaithful to their mates and gone to marry someone else. He's talking about them in a relationship with God. They have abandoned God and have gone back into the world. But we see through this writing that James has, not only have they done that, but they've done it all the while saying that we're good, we're Christians. And so James has to bring to their attention that godly people don't do things that you're doing. And he says you need to give that up. You need to abandon it. And so in chapter 5, we're talking about the continuation of that, how that they need to understand that there were people before them that had patience. There were people before them that demonstrated in the time of difficulty, they still remained faithful to God. Now here we have the contrast. The people who are scattered abroad that James is writing to apparently are not remaining faithful to God. They are at a point where they are living their lives saying that they're Christians, but their actions totally deny that. And so as he talks in chapter 5, he talks about, for example, the prophets, verse 10. He talks about Job, verse 11, how he endured. He talks about the Savior even, how he endured the trials and difficulties and did what God wanted him to do. And so he gets into chapter 5, verses 12, 13, 14. He starts talking about praying. And apparently, from what we can determine here, these people had abandoned prayer as an avenue to talk to God and to stay in that right relationship. And he starts talking about various things. He says, any among you afflicted? Let him pray. Apparently they were just at abandoned prayer. And he's sick among you, and call for the elders, and let them pray over him. Prayer of faith shall save the sick. And then in verse 16, he starts talking about that they need to confess their faults one to another. So what does that say to you about their attitudes concerning their faults? If he has to tell them to confess their faults to one to another and to pray one for another, what does that tell you about what's going on in their lives and whether or not those are recognized as faults? They want it to be hidden. They want it to be as like, this is okay. And it goes back to chapter 1, where he says, if you are tempted, don't say you're tempted of God. Can you imagine that? Living, well, I just can't help it, I went out and did something last night. It's not very, I don't really want to talk about it, but it's not my fault because God sort of led me into that. How do you get to that point? But exactly. But are we much different today? Have you ever seen people today? And I have, and I know you've run across them. Nothing's ever their fault. It's amazing to me. Well, this so and so, I broke this thing, but it wasn't my fault. Well, let's see. Well, was somebody in the room with you? No. Well, did you try to reach past it? Maybe it was on a shelf to reach something that you should have moved that item first before it fell. Yeah, but it's not my fault. And we, that's a silly analogy, but we have people today that live in the world that will do things that they know is not right, but it's not their fault. So we need to see somewhat of the attitude here. Confess your faults one to another. Pray for one another. Those were things they weren't doing. That's why James is writing to them. And so he uses that as an example, Elijah, in verse 17. New Testament reading of that says Elias, but it's Elijah if you look at 1 Kings 17:1. He says, here's a man who was a follower of God. It says here that he was a man subject to like passions. So what's he saying here? James is saying, look, you're not the only one that's ever been in these circumstances. There are other people of God who have been in circumstances like you. Elijah was a man that was subject to like passions. He was exposed to the same things. And he prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And it rained not on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth brought forth her fruit. Why is he writing this to them? Because they have abandoned prayer. And, it's somewhat like they are offering up excuses. Well, things just haven't been well. We've been suffering persecutions. We've been under trial and distress. There's reasons why we quit praying. Well, aren't those the reasons that you should be praying more? Aren't those the reasons that you should be talking to God more? Here's a man who prayed that it not rain on the earth. And it didn't rain because he had a relationship with God. He maintained it. He was a man of like passion. Means he suffered the same things or had the same desires and wants that you do. But he was able to pray to God and effectually to make something happen. And that's the point. A little bit earlier he says, if you pray, he says, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. You'll get things out of prayer if your life is conducive to receiving the things that God's going to bless us with. We're not going to live in rebellion down here and before God and say, God, well, you're not answering my prayers. We receive our prayers answered and things happen and we can speak to God because we're in a right relationship with Him. And he's trying to point that out to them. Here's Elijah. Here's a man who prayed it not rain. Well, who in the world wants to pray for it not to rain? Don't we usually pray to get rain? We want our grass to grow. We want our crops to grow, our gardens. We pray for rain. Here's a man praying that it not rain. And it didn't rain. Then he prayed for it to rain, and it rained again. And then he says in verse 19, Brethren, if any of you do err from the truth, and one convert him, let him know that he which converteth the sinner from the error of his ways shall save a soul from death, and shall hide a multitude of sins. So if I write to you and I say, you need to pray one for another, you need to look out for people who are falling and erring, you need to pray for them, you need to try to restore them, what does that say about what they were doing? They obviously weren't doing these things. They're being selfish. If you look at the way they were making do or making it through in the world the way they saw fit. And in doing so, they didn't lose the name Christians, or they were not saying we've abandoned that. They were trying to hold on to that and say, well, we're Christians, but we're undergoing some difficulties, and we're just trying to make it through the best that we can. And some of these things just sort of go by the wayside. Prayer, your actual doing of God's will, the way you treat people, the way you treat one another. Isn't that all what James is talking about as we read this short book? You've lost sight of being able to suffer through these difficulties. You try to blame God for what happens. You know what the Scriptures teach, but you don't do them. You treat people with partiality. You try to be teachers over everybody and tell them what's going on and what they should be doing, while your whole life is just like got a hole in it because you're a hypocrite in doing that. And you try to war and devour one another. You don't know how to act. And yet you're Christians. James says you can't do like that. You've got to change what you're doing. And that's how he wraps it up here. You need to not be selfish, but think about one another. And if they were provoking one another to good works, then they would be encouraging one another and being able to point out to each other, hey, this is not the way Christians should live. You need to get that out of your life. And if they were working with one another and praying with one another, and they were seeing the difficulties that each one were going under and trying to help them out of that, then they would be trying to save their souls as opposed to surviving in a world that's not their home. And isn't that what we all do? I mean, we're here. We have to be reminded pretty much on a regular basis, this world is not our home. And so we aren't here to see how much we can get or to be selfish, but we're here to do the opposite of that. We're here to give up our worldly possessions, to try to grasp hold of those heavenly possessions, and to help one another and encourage one another. And so when someone approaches you and says, well, I need to talk to you about such and such, or I need to, I've noticed, just simple things. I've noticed you haven't been here in 3 weeks. We all look at that and say, well, I'm glad you missed me. I'm glad you said something to me. Because that shows that we care. We're not selfish about what can I get. And that just goes against everything that's talked about here in James, The fact that the attitudes that they had and where they needed to be. They needed to be revectored. They needed to be set in a different direction than what they were in. And James is doing that. He's telling them what they're doing. He's telling them it's wrong, and he's telling them how they need to correct it. And so, in a nutshell, that's James. And a lot of difficulties. A good book for us to read because we face these difficulties. Elijah, that he cites here as someone of like passion, hundreds and hundreds of years before these people. And so we don't need to say, well, the Bible just doesn't address things that we're facing. Sure it does. James could be rewritten and maybe modern terminology, and it would just lay right over our lives. And so we always have to be cautious about how we're conducting ourselves and what we're claiming to be, and is that real or not? Are we really Christians? Are we acting like Christians? Are we conducting ourselves like Christians? Or are we going out trying to do everything on our own and doing it in a selfish manner? And so it makes us think, what are we doing? What's happening with our lives? And it should help us to refocus where we ought to head. It's a very valuable book for us to have studied. All right, let's spend the rest of our time looking over our fill-in-the-blank activities. And we'll try our best to get through with these today and then give us a good starting point for 1 Peter in a couple of weeks. Where is the first activity found? Well, it tells us chapter 1, so it gives you a little hint there. What verse is the part A? Verse 12? Okay. It says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Are temptations going to come? Can you build a house and lock all the windows and doors and keep temptation out? Probably not. And they're just going to come, aren't they? If we're going to do anything as we move about in this world, there's going to be temptations. And so what we've got to do with those is endure them. Not give in to them, fight them, but to endure them. For when he is tried, he shall receive what? Crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. That's there are guarantees that we have upon this earth, but it's almost comical. I guess you could laugh rather than cry or get upset about it. You ever thought that you had a warranty on something, and you take it in only to find out that the fine print says this warranty is valid only if you did this and this, and only if you happen to have your original sales receipt from 5 years ago, and only if something else. So what good is it? What good is it? Lifetime doesn't mean lifetime, does it? I like that. Lifetime warranty. Oh, I feel comfortable about this. Until you have to go find out about it, isn't it? It's not lifetime. And it didn't say anything about the major content being arsenic or anything like that. Oh, man, it's just, it sells. I mean, if you're sitting here and you're going to go to the store and here's one that has a lifetime warranty and this one doesn't really say anything about it, which one are you going to pick? I'm going to pick the one that says lifetime. Now, I found out, through over time that, well, it's only if you didn't do this to it, and only if you didn't do that to it, and oh, by the way, you have to have your original sales receipt. And you ever noticed, I don't know if anybody's ever done this, but a lot of sales receipts are printed on that sort of slick paper. In 2 years, you can't read it. So you get, hey, here's my sales receipt. Well, I can't read that. So, I mean, when God promises something, we're going to get it. And so the Christians here need to understand, don't give up. Endure temptations. When you're tried, it's going to strengthen you if you don't give up. Now, if you give up, you're not going to be strengthened. But if you endure temptations when you're tried, you will be able to receive that crown that God has promised. And that's a guarantee. If you live faithful, you'll receive a crown. I may not be the best this or that. I may not have been able to do a lot of things publicly in the church, but there's a lot of things I can do I don't have to be public with that are good things for me to do to help encourage people. And so we need to be able to remain faithful when we're tried with the temptations. All right, B part. Verse 22. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. Now, see, that's a simple verse, but it is so profound. Let's reword it just a little bit. If I only hear the words but don't do them, then what am I doing to myself? I'm deceiving myself. I am telling myself, you're following the Scriptures. And what James is saying here, the only way that you can show that you're following the Scriptures is to do them. You can't tell people you're following the Scriptures. It's going to be apparent in your actions. You're either doing it or you're not. And he's saying here, they had gotten to the point of saying, well, as long as I read the Scriptures every once in a while, that equates to what? That equates to doing them. And so, you know, if I come and listen to somebody talk about the Scriptures, or I maybe I'm in a Bible class, or, you know, or maybe there's some television program that pops up on the screen each day and has a Bible verse on it. I'm following the Scriptures because I've heard them today. That doesn't carry any weight. That doesn't mean anything. We're deceiving ourselves if we think, well, I know what the Scriptures teach, therefore I'm a Christian. I'm living as a Christian should live. No. The only way that we can demonstrate that we're living according to God's will is how we conduct ourselves. And so he says,
if you'll notice in his list, pure religion doesn't include singing. I'm going to get to a point, so don't cut me off.
okay.
It doesn't include singing. It doesn't include praying. It doesn't include attending. What does religion, true religion, consist of? It consists of helping the helpless and keeping ourselves morally clean. Singing, praying, attending worship help us accomplish those, but the real crux of religion is what you do.
And that's what James is saying here. You know, if you hear the word and you don't do it, and you claim to be something that you're not, or you think that you are this thing, you're deceiving yourselves. It's only when you conduct yourself and live your life the way it should be lived. And so we can't escape that. We need to understand that truth. That's foundational. It matters what I say. It matters what I do. It matters how I treat people. And it matters how we treat one another within the body of Christ. It matters. All right, chapter 2. Verse 9 for part A. He says here, but if you have what? Respect to persons, you do what? Wow, that verse must need to be reworded or something. You're telling me that if I show partiality to one person over the other, or treat somebody different than the other, when I show respect, that doesn't mean like I respect the person. That says how you're dealing with them. If you have a different aspect of how you're dealing with them, that's respect that he's talking about here. If you have respect to persons, there's got to be more to it than that. You're telling me that if I show partiality to somebody, that's sin? Now, that's not... We need to understand that a little bit. This is talking in terms of how you deal with them in terms of worship, how you deal with them in terms of how you associate with them. I guess I need to try to explain this without missing the point. If we have friends that come in to the auditorium, let's say, just use this setting as an example. If we have friends that come in that back door there, we may spend a little more time with them. We may brighten up a little bit more because they're here. That's understandable. But we don't ignore other people. So when you deal with somebody a little bit different because you know them, that might be acceptable. But the point here is how you deal with them in terms of accepting them in to hear the gospel, or to maybe they're Christians but you treat them different because you don't know them. Well, those are things that we need to guard against.
You decide their status in life. If you think they're low, you ignore them.
Right. It's based on their appearance. You don't know. Have you ever seen somebody that doesn't dress that well, but they're pretty wealthy? I know you have. I've seen people like they just didn't want to dress up. That wasn't what they did, but they had all kinds of money. So you can't judge people based on appearance. God looks on the inward man. He looks on the heart. That's what we need to understand about people. What's in your heart? What are you trying to be like? What are you willing to accept as far as the teachings of Christ? We need to give those opportunities. Well, if you show respect, are you ever going to be able to teach that person that comes in with raggedy clothes? Would you ever teach them? Not if I just sit over here somewhere. No, we're not going to ever teach them. They may be the people that will be receptive to the gospel. We can't always control what's happening to us in terms of how much money we make or things like that. Sometimes we're in difficult situations. And, as stories come out, sometimes we hear the truth about it and we say, oh, I've changed my mind on that. I didn't realize that. So you don't know those things until you give them that opportunity. So don't treat people with respect. James goes so far as to say this is sin. He says if you do this, you commit sin, and are convinced of the law as transgressors. You violate the law. Something that really need to pay attention to. I would hope everyone that comes into this auditorium, regardless of how they look, would be welcome. Because if we aren't helping people to come to Jesus, because we're the ambassadors for Christ, and we aren't accepting them in and wanting them to be here, aren't we missing the point of what he wanted? All right, part B. What verse do we have here? 24. You see how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. Now, he doesn't say it's all works, does he? He says they're justified by works and not faith only. So the idea he's trying to get across here is that it's coupled. And he goes on to say in part of this passage, he says, show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. How do we show people that we have faith? We do something. Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham did something. By faith, Moses did something. By faith, Rahab did something. They all showed their faith by what they did. And we show our faith by what we do. And that's what James is saying. You can't say, I'm a faithful person. Just, trust me. If you're faithful, it's going to be evident. You couldn't avoid seeing it because of how you conduct your lives. So that is something that we need to understand too. All right, chapter 3, verse 8. We talked about this quite a bit, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but he says, "But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison." Have you ever seen any of these shows, crime shows, or maybe accurately depicted investigative police shows that are on television, where somebody has gotten some poison from some plant or from some snake venom or something, and one drop will kill you? I look at those things and I say, oh, that's scary. I don't want to have anything to do with that. But James says your tongues contain deadly poison. Now you choose how you're going to use that tongue. So we need to be careful with that. You ever, bringing your boys up, some of you men or something, you take them hunting, you say, don't ever point that gun at something you don't intend to shoot, right? Don't ever point it at a person. You tell them these kind of rules. Well, couldn't we say the same thing about the tongue? Don't ever have that tongue coiled at somebody in anger. Don't use your tongue as a weapon. Those are things we need to give some good serious thought to because of the nature of the tongue being full of deadly poison. All right, part B. Verse 16, for where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. Now, who is James describing here? Who is it that's been using the tongue inappropriately? Who is it that's warring against one another? This church, these brothers that he's writing to here. And they are full of envy. Why would you be full of envy unless your heart is in the world? Unless your thought process is about the world and what you have? What would you envy? How many times do we say, well, I really envy brother so-and-so because they're just very faithful in attendance? You ever heard anybody say that? Or I really envy the fact that they teach a Bible class. Or that they're helping with the young people. Or that they wait on the Lord's table consistently. Or they're in attendance consistently. I envy that. You ever hear anybody talk about that? I don't think so. If you do, I'd like to talk to you. We envy those things that we desire and we want. And that's in the world. And most of the things that people envy about, they're in the world. And so it says, where envying and strife is, that means they couldn't get along because of their envying, wanting one another's things. That's what you expect. Isn't that what you expect out of the little 2 or 3 year olds? You got what I want, I'm going to take it away from you. There's strife there. These aren't things that you would expect adults to be partakers of, but wish it were the case, but we know it's not. And in that envy and strife, there's this confusion and every evil work. That's saying a mouthful. Not where we want to be. Something we need to guard against. Chapter 4. Verse 4 of part A. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that, what? Friendship of the world equates to what? Enmity with God. If you're going to be a friend to the world, you are at odds with God. 1 John chapter 2, I believe it is. It says, be not friends with the world. If any man loves the world, it says, love not the world. If any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So if we choose to be friends with the world, we're at enmity with God. Whosoever therefore shall be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. It's just like he says, okay, if you don't understand that, let me give it to you in another sentence here. Do not be a friend of the world. Part B. Verse 17. Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, it is sin. That's pretty simple. You know, if we know better and we don't do what we know better to do, we know we're doing wrong. And that's pretty straightforward. Chapter 5, verse 8, part 8. Verse 1. Go to now, ye rich, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Riches are not going to bring happiness. We need to understand that message. Riches will not bring happiness. And part B, verse 20, let him know that he which converteth the sinner from the error of his ways shall save a soul from death and shall hide a multitude of sins. All right, I hope James has been beneficial to you. We'll do 1 Peter starting in 2 weeks, and please make your plans to be here for our gospel meeting and try to support that.